So today we have with us Karen Elfner, and she's going to do a presentation on positive behavior supports at school and in the home. She is the project manager for data and implementation for the Behavior Alliance of South Carolina through Clemson University. Just moved up from Florida. I hope the weather treats you well up there, Karen. Karen has over 25 years of experience in behavior support, and that originated with teaching students who were labeled as severely emotionally disturbed. She's also been involved in research and also training parents and educators on family involvement and behavior support. So we're excited to have her with us today. Today's presentation is one of over 100 training opportunities that are brought to you each year by our center, Families Helping Families of Greater New Orleans. And of course, they're all completely free of charge. A few little housekeeping things to mention. Be sure that your mic stays on mute while we're on the webinar. Camera use is optional, but not necessary. We will have a Q&A time at the end. Karen will also take questions in the chat as we go, and I'll be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions, go ahead and drop those in there, and then we can have more discussion at the end if we need to. You will receive a copy of the presentation, the slide deck, and any other resources that Karen wants to share with us, and I'll be emailing those out to you. Also, I have a quick survey link that I will put in the chat box toward the end of the presentation that gives you the opportunity to give us feedback on the presentation itself, and any other comments that you have, or any other presentations you would like to see us do that we have not. These questionnaires actually help keep our funders happy because they require us to do them. And when we keep funders happy, we keep the trainings free. So we appreciate your help on that. And with that, Karen, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thanks so much for being here today.
Well, you're very welcome. I'm really happy to be here. I'm always happy to talk to parents and people who support parents. So hopefully I'll be able to provide you some things that you find useful and helpful. So we talked about, Sharon mentioned some things about my experience professionally, but I think part of what makes me feel like I've learned the most is being a mother. I have two children. One's 32, one is about to turn 29, and I'm a grandmother of two and one on the way. And I learned probably as much about parenting and relating to parents and parents in the educational system, being a parent. My son had specific learning disabilities, very dyslexic, and fought the system and got him through his educational career. And then my daughter, we had lots of challenging behaviors, which we, as an adult now, and she's a board certified behavior analyst now, she has self-diagnosed that she had some sensory disorganization issues that, we just didn't know about. So we are always learning, right? We learn from our kids even now that they're adults. So, and then I had the privilege to be a co-author of a Behavior for Parents book using the positive behavior support approaches with families. Mimi Heineman was the first author, and she felt very strongly that, and she was a PhD and a board certified behavior analyst, but she felt very strongly that parents could understand and manage behavior, and wanted to convey some of those concepts to parents that people in the field with all the letters behind their name used. And so that's what that was about. So today we have a very limited amount of time, and it's hard to share everything I want to share with you. But what we've narrowed down to is, I think one thing that came up when Sharon and I were talking is there's a lot of confusion around what's positive behavior support, PBS, and what's PBIS. What are they? What's the difference? What does it matter? And then what is it, or what could it look like in your child's school? So it may be happening or may not be happening. I know probably 20 years ago, or close to that, 18 years ago, several people on my Florida project and I trained, I think, a lot of the schools in Louisiana. So, but who's still doing it, may be another question. And then how you can apply some of the principles of positive behavior support in your home. And so we're not going to go into depth in any of these, but we'll give you some ideas and some resources and hopefully places that you could go to get more information when we're done. So we're going to start here with what is positive behavior support. So I've been in the field before it had its name. So it's been a long time. We used to call it non-aversive community-based behavior support because, and this is the definition of what it is, so you can kind of read that for yourselves, but it came about in the late 1980s, around the time that they were deinstitutionalizing people that had disabilities. But it was focusing on some non-aversive strategies. So that just means in the past, there was a lot of behavior support. You can use a lot of really negative consequences and a lot of approaches, and you can change people's behavior, but their quality of life wasn't very good. And it was to use some of the science of behavior, but to make sure that what we were doing for the individuals was actually enhancing their quality of life. Because you could make a behavior change, but if that person's life isn't better as a result, and the family's life isn't better as a result, then really what's the benefit? So that was the purpose of the field of positive behavior support that came about. And this, as I said, it was a new way to address challenging behavior. And on the left is kind of here the traditional view. So traditionally, you'd wait till there's a behavior you didn't want, and then you react to it. And the focus then is on just getting that behavior that you didn't want to see to go away, or at least be reduced, and on what we could do to make it happen as quickly as possible. And then the positive behavior support view is to try to be proactive. So it's focused on teaching skills, long-term interventions, and trying to do things that will improve that quality of life. And what we know from the science of behavior is that interventions need to be matched to the purpose of the behavior. So why the behavior is happening is the most important question to find out, because when you know why the behavior is happening, then the intervention, the prevention, and how you respond to the behavior are going to be much more effective and meaningful. So that's the key in positive behavior support. So how do we find out the purpose of behavior? That's a challenge, right? So when we talk about behavior, from the way that we think about it in positive behavior support and people who are doing this practice, we define it this way. So behavior is an action. It's something that a person does that we can see or we can hear, right? So they kind of call it like the dead man's test. So something that you would be able to notice and that you couldn't mistake it for being a dead man. So we don't really think about in terms of what things you think or feel, although we do know that how you think about things can impact your behavior, and they're important. And we can get into some of all of that at another time. But so we're talking here about behaviors that we can see and we can measure them, and they're repeated. And they're things that I could describe and you could describe, and we could agree that we're seeing the same thing. In behavior, we know all that it communicates. So if we are paying attention to behaviors, and here I'm not just talking about those problematic behaviors maybe that we're concerned with, but even positive behaviors that we really like and enjoy. All behavior is what we think of as communicating a message. So sometimes children will use behavior to communicate because they have limited social skills, or they don't have a lot of language. And so they use their behavior. Think of like toddlers who don't have language yet. Their behavior, their sounds, their actions, that's the way that they communicate with us, right? Because they don't have words yet. Or because children learn that challenging behavior results in meeting particular needs. Sometimes that learning is not conscious. So it's not that a child realizes, oh, if I do this, then this happens. Sometimes that just sort of happens below the surface of our awareness. But we do know that all behavior occurs for a reason. So they are learned and they continue because the behavior serves the purpose or the function. And we'll talk some about what some of those functions are. And then we've learned that they get us the outcomes that we want. And as I said, sometimes that learning isn't something that we're necessarily aware of, but it's happening. So we'll talk a little bit more now about the behavior. So when we think about behaviors, right? So here are a bunch of things that we could all agree are behaviors. There's something we can see or we can hear. They're observable. We could measure them. Right. So you got all of these kinds of activities, right? And then there's something that in the field we're starting to call contextually inappropriate behavior. So if you hear that term, we used to use the words problem behavior, and then we changed it to challenging behavior, trying to use a term when we're talking about the behavior that we want to minimize in a way that is accurate and clear. Well, sometimes, all behavior happens in the context of when that behavior happens in the certain setting and who's there and where you are and what the expectations are in that setting. So when we talk about a behavior that we don't want to see, we now are calling it contextually inappropriate, because like this picture, this little girl, she was running. Well, running isn't a bad behavior. It's just that at times running is not okay. There are times when running is okay and times when it's not. So the context in which we see the running is what makes it acceptable or not acceptable to engage in that behavior. So like tattletelling, in some cases, you might say, well, I just don't like that behavior and I don't want it to happen. But in other times, if there's like something really bad going on and you want a child to let you know that something's happening, then that would be contextually appropriate to tell. And then you have the student or the child here who's chewing on their sleeve, right? So chewing or even chewing on your clothing, right? So that you get to decide, is that contextually appropriate or inappropriate? And you'll notice when we talk about different behaviors, which things are appropriate when, who gets to decide? And it's usually the people who are kind of in charge in that context. So in schools, the educators, they generally are deciding what's appropriate and not. And at home, you get to decide as a parent what's contextually appropriate. What kind of language do we use? Growing up, I didn't like the word FART. So my children would say poot or, different words like that. And their cousins always use the word FART. And when they would say it, my children were just like, oh, they said the F word, because they had learned that that was inappropriate. But when they were at their cousin's house, it was an appropriate behavior. So that's what we mean when we're talking about behaviors as being related to the context. The other thing that's really important if we're going to try to make an impact on a behavior, if we want to increase it or decrease it, is being very clear about the behavior that we're trying to address. So one of the concerns that we have when we're dealing with behavior is sometimes people use very vague words to describe a behavior, or ones that I might not understand what you mean when you say that word. So we'll look at a couple of examples. So if I say Julia is aggressive, my idea of what aggressive looks like may be different from yours, right? So a descriptive way to explain that is that Julia hits her brother when she doesn't get access to her preferred toys. So hitting is what we're really describing as the aggressive behavior here. So Michael is disruptive. Disruptive is another one of those terms that we hear a lot in school settings, and teachers will say they're being disruptive. Well, what does that look like? What does that sound like? To what magnitude is this disruption happening? Because the word in and of itself only means something to the person who's using it. So here you can see we've described it: yelling in the car, shouting, making screeching noises when she's trying to talk to dad, who's also in the front seat. So there I know what we mean when we're saying disruptive. And then Jenny is hyperactive. Well, I might have a sense of what hyperactive means, but I don't know what that looks like in the situation where you're trying to fix it or change it. So here she's leaving her assigned area without permission. She blurts out answers without raising her hand. So those are the actual measurable behaviors that we're trying to address. Okay, so as I mentioned, if we can decide which behaviors are contextually not appropriate and we want to work on them, then the next thing that we have to do is understand the behavior, what function or purpose this behavior is serving in that context. So all behaviors serve a function, and you can kind of narrow it down to behaviors either about getting access to something or avoiding or getting away from something. And those somethings we categorize in this way: attention. So sometimes I really want attention. I want people to talk to me. I want people to notice me. And sometimes, and some people in certain situations are avoiding. They will look away. They're very quiet. They're trying to avoid anybody paying attention to them. And then there's tangible things or activities. So sometimes, like for children, it's a lot of times it's around games or toys or things that they're video game they're playing with. They want those things. They want access to that. Or maybe in an academic setting, or if it comes to doing chores or less preferred things, then maybe they're trying to avoid those things in their behavior. And then there's this whole sensory category. And I mentioned this for my daughter. We didn't understand the impact of sensory issues. So she had a lot of behaviors that were around avoiding sensory. She didn't like the way things felt. And so she would have a lot of problem behaviors that we would define as like screaming, yelling, throwing, that kind of thing, as a way to try to avoid the thing that gave her a sensory bad feeling. But sometimes people like sensory, like I enjoy music, or I like being touched, or hugs, or swinging, or things like that. So if you think about even, it's helpful to think about yourself as an adult, like what kind of things do you find reinforcing? Do you really like attention? Do you like doing things or going places or getting things? And it helps to kind of realize that a lot of the things that we all do serve a function. Okay, let me just take a little pause there before we get into a little bit more about how we understand the purpose or functions of behavior, and make sure that I don't have any questions about anything we've talked about. Don't think so. I'm looking over at my chat box.
I haven't seen any questions yet.
Okay. Okay, so then I'll just move forward. If you have questions, feel free. I want this to make sense for you, so please feel free to ask questions if there's anything that I say or describe that you don't understand or would like to comment on. So then one of the main ways that we figure out what the purpose or the function of the behavior is by the ABCs, we call it, of behavior. And this is when we use words that are kind of from the behavior analysis field. Antecedent, which just is the word that means the thing that happens before the behavior, or setting that's what's happening right before the behavior. Then the behavior, which is what they say or do that we've defined, and then the consequence. And in this sense, sometimes we use the word consequence to mean you're going to get a consequence, and it's a negative connotation. But in this situation, we just mean the events that follow the behavior. What happens immediately around that individual after they engage in that behavior. So the antecedent, what's happening right before the behavior happens, and then what the person does, and then what happens after. And what we know is that if I do engage in a behavior, and what happens immediately after the behavior, the consequence, is not reinforcing. It's not getting me what I'm trying to avoid or get as a result of the behavior. It's less likely I'm going to use that behavior again. But if what happens after that behavior helps me get or avoid what I'm trying to do, then it makes it more likely that I'm going to engage in that behavior. So it's really the consequence, or what happens after the behavior, that is helping us to understand. Because if this happens and the behavior is more likely to happen again, then helps us to understand why the behavior is happening. So oftentimes when we're thinking about behavior, we think about what's happening right before. So I ask Sam to go clean his room, and then he screams and yells and throws himself on the ground, and it sounds like my asking him to clean his room is what's causing the behavior. But that's not true. Only if throwing himself on the ground is trying to get him, it's what happens after him throwing himself on the ground. So if he throws himself on the ground and I ignore him, give him a little bit of time, and then remind him you have this much time to get the room clean, and then he might throw himself on the ground again. But if throwing himself on the ground does not result in his avoiding having to clean the room, then the behavior doesn't pay off. It doesn't meet if that's why he was doing it, if he was doing it to avoid the cleaning of the room. So that's why it's really important that we start to understand and how our responses as adults to behavior can make it either more likely or less likely that we'll see a behavior again. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So here's a little example. So Sam sees a cookie, and Sam screams, and then Sam gets cookie. Okay, so if this happens, and the ABCs, if you start to notice patterns, so it helps to think through or even document what's happening when right before a behavior happens, and how the environment is responding to that behavior, whether it's you or other people or whatever, in a repeated manner. So if it happens over and over and over in this, so yeah, he wants a cookie, he screams, I don't want to give him a cookie, but I'm on the phone and I can't take it anymore, and he gets the cookie. Well, then he would learn that if I scream, I'll get the cookie. Right? But if he sees a cookie, screams, and he doesn't get the cookie, then if screaming was an effort to get the cookie, then eventually screaming would stop because it would be ineffective. And the problem it with changing behavior is if you have in the past given the cookie when the screaming happened, it takes a little while for that to fade out, that learned, like if I scream long enough, I get the cookie. And then there's sometimes even what we call in the field an extinction burst. So sometimes it gets worse before it goes away. So that's when you kind of have to just kind of grit your teeth and just be strong and believe in the science that, no, if I don't respond to and give in to meet that, what they're trying to get out of that behavior, it will eventually fade. So as I said, I think I just gave away his yelling was to get access to the cookie. So I'm going to give you a little home-based example that's from our book on resolving challenging behavior. But it's going to be very quick because we only have a little bit of time. But there are 3 examples that we go through in the book, and then there are 3 standalone examples at the end. So 6 different kinds of examples. So in this book, one of the individuals is Michael, a young man who was about 9 years old. And the behavior his mom called dawdling. So that took some defining, right? What does dawdling mean to you? How am I going to change a behavior if I don't know exactly what it is, what it looks like, and when it happens? So this is how it was described. Michael would remain in bed, ignore his mom's specific request to get up and get ready for school. He would whine, pull blankets over his head, turn towards the wall, and his mother coming in and giving him, more requests or upping the volume of the requests or adding consequences to if you don't, didn't seem to help. So this happened how much? Well, he missed carpool due to this dawdling 2 to 3 times a week, which meant that she had to drive him and then she would be late for work. So it became a problem for the whole family. And then another thing we do in terms of deciding if it's a behavior worth spending time on is think about, we call it the big Ds. Is it disruptive? Is it dangerous? Is it developmentally appropriate? Is it disgusting? Because, socially, we want to help our children be socially acceptable. So for him, it was disruptive. And she thought that it was developmentally inappropriate for a 9-year-old not to be able to get out of bed when asked. So again, we're back to our ABCs, right? So what was happening before? If you think about it in terms of who was there, where was it happening, when in the day, when in the week, and then what exactly happened, and then that behavior that we're focused on, and then what happens, afterwards. So then after you've done that and looked at that, every time the behavior happens, you go, wait, what just happened before? And then how are people in the environment responding after? And you can eventually find some patterns. If you don't have patterns, then you haven't either pinpointed the behavior or looked long enough at the routines. So for Michael, it was happening mostly on school mornings when there was a time pressure, at home with his mom when they were getting ready for school. But on the mornings his mom was driving, it was less likely to happen. And it was least likely when she was driving the carpool and when they had less time pressures, like on Sunday. They still got up and went to church, but they were going together. There was less time pressure. Definitely didn't happen when they had activities that they were going to do together or at home. So we hypothesized, which is just a guess for the function, that she was trying to get attention from his mom and perhaps avoid unpleasant situations at school, because context, he had a specific learning disability and had some social issues. He wasn't really able to make a lot of friends. He had a lot of challenges in that way. So based on that understanding of the behavior, we develop a plan, and plans have that match the antecedent, what happens before, prevention, and consequence. So what are we going to do to try to prevent the problem from happening in the first place. Sometimes you can't eliminate the setting or the requirement that's causing the behavior, but sometimes you can do things that make it less likely that it's going to happen. So sometimes it's clarifying expectations here, restructuring the home environment, and then the behavior. So whatever the behavior is that they're engaging in, is there a way to achieve that same goal in a more appropriate way, and teaching some skills, and then how to respond, like the screaming for the cookie. Is there a way to have him be able to use his words and say, I really would like a cookie? And then you could have a conversation about, is it okay to have a cookie now? Maybe you can have a cookie later, and have him, the goal of getting a cookie happen for the appropriate way of engaging in the behavior. And then the management strategies, that's when the adult behavior is really important, because we want to make sure we're not reinforcing their goal for the behavior. So we also need to make sure that we're looking at remembering that we want to improve overall lifestyle, give support to those people who are going to have to be implementing the plan. So for Michael, they set up some clear morning routine and expectations. So they actually put together a little chart. So this is what you need to get up, get dressed, brush your teeth, brush your hair, shoes on, come downstairs. And then the mom was also going to talk to the teacher about what was happening at school to see if she could get more information about ways to make school a better place for him. And then they taught him to follow the routine, to go through the little checklist. And they actually taught him how to initiate with other kids. Some kids just don't know how to make that first, like if you see a kid playing, how to go up and engage with them. And so they taught him they gave him some social scripts. And then she would praise him if he was following the morning routine. And if he got ready on time, then mom would make him a hot breakfast, and they'd have 10 minutes together, do an activity while he ate breakfast. And then if he was ready for the whole week, then he got to do a special activity with mom on the weekends. But they also encouraged the other carpool parents to greet him warmly, and they kept some of the toys that were his favorites in the car for him to play. To prevent and the overall context, they made sure he was all showered the night before. She prepped for the hot breakfast, and she also had him pick out his clothes and a couple things to make the morning a little smoother. So that's just a very cursory view of a process that we went through with one individual. So what we want to do through positive behavior support is learn to understand your child's behavior so you can manage it effectively. But you can also help educators get to know your child better so that they may better understand some of the functions of their behaviors and manage them more effectively. So in the PowerPoint, I've got, and this is in 2 places. So when you get that, you'll see all of these great places that you can go to get information on functional behavioral assessments, which we'll talk about in a little bit, how it's used, a checklist for behavior support plans. This practice routines are videos of the different steps in the process that I just kind of talked about. So how do you define a behavior? Then how are you, looking at the ABCs and that sort of thing. And then there's this one has the Family Connection of South Carolina, because that's from my state resource. But on the last slide where I repeat these, I have your Louisiana group. And then there's a Home and Community Positive Behavior Support Network, which I'm a part of, which is part of the Association for Positive Behavior Support. And we do family chats through Facebook. We have webinars and other resources. So if you join us and like us in your social media accounts, if you go to the website, you can get the links there. Then you'll know when the chats are coming. And the chats are very popular because they're around really practical things that families, and a lot of families that have individuals with disabilities in particular, find challenging. And it very much is a chat. There's a lot of engagement with those people who are participating. So one thing that we recommend, and we actually help our educators to try to do things like this with all their children in schools, but is help educators know about your child. So one thing I'll share with Sharon to give to you is an About My Child document. So we have a little template, and then it helps the educators to understand what your child's likes and dislikes, strengths, and what works with them, what doesn't work. Like shouting at them doesn't work, but if you whisper quietly in their ear, that really is effective. So we know our children better than anybody else. And sometimes it's those little things that we know about them that can be helpful when working and managing to make sure their time is as good as it can be in the classroom. So then that brings us to this concept of positive behavior interventions and support. So positive behavior support, which again started in the late 80s, expanded into organizations and systems like schools. And it did that, the term positive behavior intervention became tied to school in organizations. So and safe, where everybody can be their best and have good, as high a quality of life as possible.
Karen,
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but you broke up really bad right as you started this slide. So we didn't hear any of that. No, you're breaking up again. I don't think it's me because I'm still getting messages from everybody. Y'all be patient. We're working it out. Hopefully we won't lose her.
Be better now?
Keep talking. Let's see. It still looks a little shaky.
Well, the other
Nope.
no, okay. Can you hear me?
I think we've almost lost you. You're just very pixelated and the sound is not good.
I'm gonna leave my video off. I'm gonna leave my video off for right now, and then if we get to question and answer, I'll turn it back on.
Okay.
Just in case that helps. Okay. And I gotta share my screen again. I think you have to make me able to share again.
Sorry about that. Hang on.
Okay, here we are again.
Yay, we can still hear you, so proceed.
Great. Well, at least it happened at a break in concept. So we're talking about positive behavior interventions and support. So sometimes people get confused around what's PBS, positive behavior support, and PBIS. Well, PBIS came about after PBS. It's sort of under the umbrella of PBS. And it was an expansion of the principles of positive behavior supports to organizations and systems like schools. So essentially what happened is we were going in as people trying to help do PBS in around a single student in a school, and we would go to a classroom and we would say, well, this classroom needs support, this whole system needs help. And so we realized that it was really ineffective to, there were some things that needed to happen at the systems level before we could know whether it was an individual child issue that needed to be addressed, or if the system were more positive, predictable, equitable, and safe, maybe we wouldn't have as many problems, and then we'd know which students really did need that extra resource and support. So now we have this evidence-based tiered framework that we call PBIS, and generally, these are some of the things that we're talking about. It's about creating safer, effective school systems. It's focused on the entire school. It applies to everybody in the school, and to help create an environment where students feel welcome, successful, and know and understand the expectations. And it also focuses heavily on prevention and teaching. So when I'm teaching the behaviors that I want to see, then I also want to reinforce them, right? We want how we respond to the behavior to make it more likely we'll see the behavior that we want. So understanding why behavior is happening in order to address them effectively. So some of those same principles that we were talking about at individual level. But in a school setting, PBIS, as I said, is a multi-tiered system of support, and that now has become a practice that and a framework that schools use to address both academic and behavior, both. So the bottom part, we call the bottom part of the triangle, that's prevention and instruction that everybody gets, right? So it's your language arts curriculum, it's your math curriculum, and it's your what behaviors you expect everybody to follow and engage in, and the expectations for how people are going to interact with each other, how they're going to behave in the hallway, in the classroom, and in the cafeteria. And if you do the right kind of instruction for students, you should be getting about 80% of your students should be successful with that prevention and instruction. And then you should be doing some kind of screening. So how do I know which students are successful and not successful? And when I can identify those who are not successful, then I'm going to figure out what they need. And then that's where we get to that middle part, which is some. So there might be interventions, like think about with language, like maybe it's phonemic awareness. Like I have a group of kids that need phonemic awareness. That's the skill that they have a deficit in. So I can group those kids together, give them some additional instruction. I'm still giving them the tier 1 instruction, but I'm also giving them this additional instruction that they need to, so that they can master the expectations. So the same thing with behavior. For some students, they're going to need a little more instruction, a little more focus, a little more practice in order to get it. And when students have common needs around behavior and social skills, they can get those met in groups as well. So that's where that some. And then a few students need very specific, individualized, or sometimes intensive interventions, which just means they have such unique needs that we can't say they have exact same needs as other students and we group them together with a common intervention. But we really need to look at what the problem is, why is it happening, and develop the intervention that makes sense for that individual student and why that behavior is happening. So, and in all of this, we're using data to understand what's going on and to make decisions about the intervention and determine if the intervention is being successful. So what can you expect as families from a tier 1 a behavior intervention support framework, you would have positively stated expectations that would be posted around the school. So expectations are those broad level concepts that apply to everybody who enters the building. So it's students, it's staff, it's everybody, it's visitors. So those are things like be respectful, be responsible, be safe. And what that looks like to be respectful or responsible or safe looks different, right? So what that looks like may be different in the hallway or the cafeteria or the playground or the bus ramp. And so we actually clarify what safety looks like in the hallway. We're going to use walking feet, keep our hands to ourselves, so it's defined for the students very clearly. So they know what the behaviors are that are expected in different settings that will help them to meet the expectations for the school. And then usually there's a way that we recognize when those expectations and rules are followed. So the recognition systems look very different. Often they're like a token system. Sometimes they're bucks or something like that that are redeemable for activities or things. Sometimes there are social recognition. You get to come and be on the morning show. You get to come, to the principal's office or your special lunch. So understanding what reinforces your students is, again, going to be important, because if what I really like as a student is I don't like schoolwork, and what really motivates me is escaping schoolwork, then maybe it's get out a homework pass. So it's really important in schools understand your students. And that's where having that know about my child form would be very helpful to staff, because they could then understand what motivates, what your child's interested in, what their preferences are. You could expect to get information and updates on what's going on at the tier 1 level, like what are those expectations and rules and some of the behavior data. So schools are supposed to be doing database problem solving that would inform what they need to do. So if I have a lot of students that are having a lot of fights or a lot of being aggressive towards each other, or whatever behavioral categories we have, then we might look back and say, that's not really being respectful. So we need to reteach how to be respectful and help students and how do we reinforce being respectful and what that looks like. So using data to inform what they're doing and what they're teaching and how they're focusing. And then schools should give you the opportunity to give some input and feedback into what they're doing in these systems. So this is an example of school-wide expectations: respect, responsible, and safe, and some of the way that they have defined what that looks like. So those would be what we call rules in different areas of the school. So you see they've got it very clear what it looks like, and it looks a little different in different areas because they're contextual. So some behaviors are contextually appropriate. And so here's an example of taking those same expectations and applying them to a home. So here you have a morning routine, a getting to school, homework, playtime, mealtime, evening routine, and they applied it to the same expectations that they had at the school. So building on what they're already learning at school, which is how to be responsible. So what does that look like at home? What does being responsible look like in different home settings, and safe? And so this is a nice way to both build on what they're already learning at school, but also help to structure things at home to be more effective. And suggestions for wording. So it's really important for rules, how we're defining what those expectations look like, are positively stated and convey what we want to see, right? So if we understand what we don't want, then what we need to do is figure out how do we flip that in terms of how we describe it so that they know what to do. I know that for even particularly for very young children, if you tell them don't, whatever you say afterwards, they don't get. So they don't get the don't part. So if I say don't run, they hear run, they don't understand the qualifier ahead of time. So it's like they already automatically think you're telling them what to do, right? So let's go with that. What is it that we want to be telling them that we want them to do? So if we don't want them to bother you when you're on a work call, what kind of instruction are we giving them to do? So then that's that bottom tier, right? That's if we do instruction and prevention and teaching and reinforcing of those expectations and rules, about 80% of our students should be responding effectively. But there are some students that are going to need a little more. So if you get notified, you should be getting notified if your student isn't meeting the expectations at tier 1, and you should be able to be told what data was used to identify your student as needing more support, and then what interventions they're going to use to help them to meet the expectations, and then to get updates. And I would want updates on how the intervention is going. Are they really doing the intervention as it was intended? And then how's my child responding to that? And then are they still getting what they should be getting at the tier 1? Because it's a supplement, it's not a substitute. And then at tier 3, what can you expect? So think about that process that we talked about at the beginning. That's a tier 3 process. It's an individualized. And if your child has a need for individualized behavior support, you should get invitations to some problem solving. They will do either a functional behavioral assessment and the related behavior intervention plans. And we'll talk about, I mean, that is required in some cases and not required in other cases, but as a parent, I would ask for that, even if it was not something that was required by law, because I want the educational staff to understand the why of the behavior. So they should also be able to tell you what the supports that your child is receiving. So what was the result of the functional behavioral assessment? What did they determine the function of the behavior is? And then updates on how that intervention is going, and an opportunity to engage in conversation about the intervention and how your child is doing. So in our, we propose that schools need to engage families across however they're dealing with students at this individualized level. So families should be aware if they're having challenges with your child behaviorally, that you should know what's been tried with your child. You should be able to provide input to help them to be able to perhaps come up with ideas about what's more effective or understanding the function of the behavior. And if they get to the point of a functional behavior assessment, I would advocate to be on the team that's doing this assessment. And primarily because, remember we talked about PBS being coming into practice as a way to build better quality of life and not just to extinguish a problem behavior. Very often in school systems, the FBA process has become one that's very school-centered. So it's how do we get this behavior that's a problem for the teachers to stop happening? And they'll come up with some instructional skills because that's part of the FBA and the BIP, but they don't generally come up with broad goals, which I want to know how this is going to help my child with their overall quality of life, and with my goal for him to graduate high school and to be, able to work in a, community setting, or whatever my goals are for my child. And the other thing is, how can you generalize? So if these behaviors are ones that are problematic also at home, how can we learn the function and apply some of these prevention intervention strategies across settings that will help to strengthen the new skills and the improve the quality of life. So what we have a tool. So even before you get to doing a functional behavior assessment, we encourage our teachers to, when they're going to problem solve, to use function-based thinking. And this is a tool that, again, you'll get a copy of, but we ask for them to get family input into problem solving. So we would have them have a conversation with you as a parent. We're experiencing some challenges with whatever the behavior is, and define it. This is concerning for your child because, and this is where we get into what's the broader goal, because it's keeping them from having friends. It's keeping them from really being able to get the work that they need to be able to meet the academic skills. And so it's not just about removing a problem behavior, but it's about helping your child reach a better quality of life. So again, even if your school is not one that's implementing this multi-tiered framework for behavior, if your child has persistent behavior problems, you can request a functional assessment. It's required under IDEA if your child's behavior is caused or related to a disability, but you can request a functional assessment even if your child has not been identified with a disability. So again, here are some more resources that you can go to. And I'm going to take the last couple minutes to make sure that I have a chance to answer any questions.
I did have one, and I was asking Renee if she answered your question. She said she wanted to know how to incorporate this information into an IEP.
Well, if they have a behavioral goal in their IEP, then they should have a functional behavioral assessment that has been done. And if they have one and it hasn't been done recently, then you could request an updated functional behavioral assessment. Or if they currently don't have a behavioral goal in their IEP, then, and you and the teacher are identifying behavioral problems, then if you add a behavioral goal, then they would have to do an FBA.
She also said it seems like the IEP is for the accommodations, but the BIP would include more of the specifics to working through preferred behaviors.
Yeah, that's exactly how I see. They will have broad goals on an IEP, but in terms of what the teachers and the staff are going to do specifically to help them to reach that goal, those are the interventions that would have to come through an FBA BIP.
So is the school supposed to keep a record then of the like keep the data on the ABCs and is that part of the FBA?
That's part of the FBA, and depending on the school and the school system, it's not always done as effectively as in other places. So some people will contract out to be board certified behavior analysts, BCBAs, to do the FBAs. So they will have people come in, do an FBA, who doesn't know the classroom, doesn't know the student, just does it like clinically speaking, and then gives you, here, this is the function of the behavior. And then somebody else takes that information and develops a behavior intervention plan based on that function that the BCBA identified. The problem that we've found is that if the teacher who has to implement an intervention doesn't understand the function or buy into understanding the function, and if the teacher isn't part of developing an intervention plan, then the likelihood that the intervention is going to be carried out effectively is pretty small. And when it comes down to it, it's all about what actually happens for your child. So intervention plans have gotten a little better on paper, but there's very little tracking of, is the fidelity of the intervention, is the intervention being carried out, all the steps of the intervention that we developed, are those happening? Are they happening every time? Are they happening as we intended them to happen? And very often they'll talk about maybe a student's behavior, but how are they tracking that behavior? Are they systematically looking at that behavior? What measures are they using that are sensitive enough to and regular enough to so that you know whether the intervention's working or not? So if they say it's not working, then I would say, well, show me the evidence that you've been implementing the intervention, which would be some sort of measure of fidelity.
Right. And if it's not working, that doesn't mean pitch the whole thing. It means do something different.
Maybe, yeah, right, exactly. Go back to maybe we had the function wrong, or yeah.
Right. Also had a comment in the chat. An FBA is considered an evaluation, so parental consent is usually required. When providing that signature, this is a good time to ask these questions about your involvement in the process, etc. You could also tell them that I'm sorry, I lost my place. You could also tell them that you would like to discuss ideas they develop as a result of the FBA that you could use at home to address similar behaviors at home. Remember, parental training is a part of IDEA as well, so this would definitely be an appropriate request.
I love that advice and recommendation. So
this may be totally off the wall, I don't know, but since we are talking about school as well as home, what if you can't control that that outcome or that consequence? Like if you're in a classroom and a child is acting a certain way in class and their peers are rewarding them, by snickering, or, what can you do with that?
well, we actually work on training them. So what are the peers getting out of the snickering, and helping the peers to reinforcing the peers for not engaging. So sometimes it takes another step or two to try to, if it's not you, the adult, that's doing the responding, but it's peers, then maybe there's some teaching, some coaching, some reinforcing for their being able to ignore. Teaching ignoring behaviors is a really useful skill for students in the classroom to have too, and then reinforcing them when they use that ignoring behavior.
Interesting. Well, I don't see any more questions in the chat. I have dropped the link for the survey, everyone, if you wouldn't mind clicking on that while we finish up, and then you can have that to do the survey for us and give us some feedback on the presentation today, and I would appreciate that. Karen, thank you so much for being here today. This has been, I think, very valuable information, and I look forward to getting the PowerPoint and the resources that you'll be sending us.
I thought that I sent those to you last week when I thought it was last week, but I can send it one more time just to make sure.
I don't know that I got it. I'm sorry.
Okay, no worries. I'll resend it now. Okay. Well, thank you. I really appreciate you all being here.
Yes, thank you, everyone, and grab that link to the survey before you exit. Y'all have a great day.